Pro Football Focus's Trevor Sikkema is my guest today as he weighs in on, well, everything Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That is coming up on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into this Thursday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily Buccaneers podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Bucs your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And you can follow me, your host, David Harrison, on Twitter at dharrison82, credential member of the media and staff writer for BucsGameDay.com, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with our everydayers. And as always, we want to share our appreciation and for your continued support for the show. On today's episode, we're talking about Baker Mayfield versus Kyle Trask, offseason assessments, and the future of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And we're doing that with Pro Football Focus's own Tampa Bay Trevor Sikkema. Joined now on the Locked On Bucs podcast by Trevor Sikkema on Twitter at Tampa Bay Trey, providing NFL and NFL draft coverage for Pro Football Focus, co-host of the NFL Stock Exchange, and the creator, at least as far as I'm concerned, of the Three Sides Minimum movement. I saw another Buccaneers fan favorite, Carmen Vitale, recently upheld that requirement. So good on Carmen for doing it. And I learned something. I didn't know that meats could actually be another side. So that makes this fat guy very, very happy. And Trevor, I want to thank you obviously for being on the program today. And I want to dive into something that's maybe not the sexiest storyline to follow this OTA period into training camp from a national perspective, but certainly it could prove to be the most important decision facing head coach Todd Bowles this season. And that, of course, is who the starting quarterback is going to be, and the battle between Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask to be that guy, following up on only the greatest quarterback to ever play the game. So what are your views on each of these guys, really, and then especially just this quarterback battle in general?
Yeah, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because, you know, these guys are really getting these first team reps and they're getting that first team attention for the first time in Tampa. Certainly, this is the first time that Kyle Trask is in this position. Baker Mayfield's been in this position before, but you look back at kind of what his road has been in the NFL, and for the Bucs fans that want to look at it through rose-colored glasses, if you will, you can look at things that happened in Cleveland that were not to his advantage. You could look at things in Carolina. It was never a situation where he was really going to thrive. This stint with the Los Angeles Rams, I mean, he gets in there beyond midseason, so you're not really expecting him to come in and light the world on fire in that situation. And so, you know, sure, this is his fourth team in, what is it, a year and a half? I think it's his fourth team in a year and a half. And you go, all right, well, that's not a great track record for a quarterback, but there is reason to believe why maybe the best of Baker Mayfield could still certainly come up in Tampa Bay. I know Bruce Arians is a big fan of his. You know, there's the quote that he had him as one of his highest graded quarterbacks when he was coming out, and it makes total sense, right? I mean, Baker is exactly the type of quarterback that Bruce Arians loves. And so even though he's not the head coach anymore, you know, he's got a hand in some of the decisions that are made with the roster moves and constructing what is now this current Tampa Bay team. And, you know, when I look at Kyle Trask and Mayfield, I do think that it's going to be Mayfield's job to lose. I think that Mayfield, unless he is just really playing poorly throughout training camp and the preseason, I think they're going to give this guy the benefit of the doubt as a former number one overall pick, somebody who has a ton of talent, had a ton of production when he was at Oklahoma. Obviously, the attitude, the moxie, the leadership, the personality. I think that is what they want to gravitate towards for a guy that they can invest in at the quarterback position. So I do think that it's Mayfield's job to lose, but I don't necessarily think that Trask can't get to that point. I was just always skeptical of whether or not that would be the case for Trask at all during his career. I graduated from the University of Florida, so I watched every single game that Trask played. And I did not see a starting NFL quarterback when I watched Trask. Maybe like a spot starter kind of a player, but I always felt like he was probably more destined to be a backup in the NFL. And maybe he'll prove me wrong in the best way, right? But that's kind of the way that I look at these two players is, sure, there's reasons to be optimistic about both of them, but those reasons to be skeptical are legit. It's not like those are just people who are hating on the team who are kind of bringing that part up. I think it's going to be really interesting and fascinating, honestly, to see kind of what plays out as we get through training camp and beyond.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you said all that. Not only because I obviously agree with you, because that's kind of the drum that we've been beating here on the Locked On Bucs podcast, but because we do have some Gator listeners and viewers who have accused us of just not liking Kyle Trask, and we've tried to reinforce to everybody that's not the case. We don't have a reason to dislike Kyle Trask. So you saying it for good reason will carry a little bit more weight, hopefully resonate with more people. Now, a lot of your followers, of course, the reason it resonates because a lot of your followers are Bucs fans and they love you from your Bucs coverage in the past. But of course, a lot of them also love your draft coverage and followed you to the Draft Network and now to Pro Football Focus. So let's kind of combine all of those worlds and see if we can get three sides of Bucs draft takes from Trevor Sikkema. I need your favorite pick, your least favorite pick, and your sleeper pick from this year's draft class.
Oh, man. Okay. My favorite pick. I feel like my favorite pick's got to be Cody Mauch because he feels like he's the most Jason Licht pick of all time. Just, when you look at the offensive lineman that Jason Licht has brought in over the last, really just throughout his whole tenure as general manager, Ali Marpet, small school, tough as nails, spit and vinegar guy. I mean, that's exactly what Ryan Jensen is as well when they go out and spend money to bring him in. I mean, Alex Kappa was just this, again, small school dude that they let, and Cody Mauch's the exact same way, right? He's got no teeth like a hockey player. He's got long red hair, and he can just play all of these positions on the offensive line because he feels like a natural at offensive line. And so, when I look at this roster, the O-line is one of the biggest question marks. There's no doubt about it. And I think that there are starting snaps to be had that Cody Mauch could potentially earn. So them getting him in the second round, I think was really huge for them because I was definitely team draft O-line in the first round. Now I like Elijah Cansey and I like him getting in with Todd Bowles and them using his versatility really as an edge player as well as an interior player. I think they're going to use him all over. So for the places that Elijah Cansey could have gone, Tampa is one of the ones that is most favorable. So I do like that selection, but I was really big on picking an offensive tackle. Like I probably would have gone Anton Harrison, honestly, if I was making the pick there at the back part of the 20s or the back part of the teens there. And when they didn't select an offensive lineman, I got kind of nervous for him. It's like, all right, I like what Cansey could be for this team, but you're running a risk. I mean, you lost Donovan Smith. You lost Shaq Mason. You're obviously making up for losses along the offensive line that you had the year before as well. You've got young guys in the building, but how many of those guys are starting caliber players? And so a lot of question marks for them to get Mauch in the second round. I think that was really big for them. So I think he's my favorite pick there. Least favorite pick? Man, I don't know if I had a least favorite pick. I really liked what the Bucs did in the draft. I'm looking at a lot of these selections and I don't really find any of them pointless or not good fits or anything like that, man. I really did like this class overall. Like even the depth guys like Trey Palmer, Payne Durham, like Jose Ramirez, all of these guys could be contributing players for them. So
that's fair, Trevor. So let me fill that slot with this one real quick. You mentioned Trey Palmer. I've got Kenny Bell PTSD. So is there something that you can tell me and anybody who might be in the same boat with me to tell me ahead of time? Because obviously we haven't seen Trey against contact yet. That's not going to come for a little while.
Right.
Do you have that same concern, or do you think that my concerns are legitimately placed too far in the past?
No, I don't think that you can. Look, I know why you've got the PTSD with it because he came in right when I was first covering the Bucs for Pewter Report. So I remember Kenny Bell and I remember, watching his highlights and you go, holy cow, this dude's physical, right? The blocking profile, the yards after catch, the breaking tackles, the contested catches, you went, that's where he's going to win the NFL. And then sure enough, you watch him in training camp and he didn't win in that way. Like he was shying away from those opportunities. He looked overpowered. And that was kind of the point where you go, oh man, all right, well, if he can't win in that similar way, then I don't know how he wins really in the NFL. Palmer's kind of a different player. I think he's going to win a lot more with speed. I think he's a lot more comfortable in his athleticism. And Bell was a limited athlete, right? And so if you couldn't win with strength, you really weren't finding a lot of areas where he was going to win. I think Palmer's a different kind of receiver. So I wouldn't have too much PTSD on that one. I think that he is going to be a really good depth player for them, especially with Scotty Miller no longer there on the team. That's an easy role for him to fill as that speed element player a little bit further down the depth chart.
Coming up next, we're going to get Trevor's assessment of the offseason, NFL draft, free agent additions, and losses. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Bucs is brought to you by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers can get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. The NBA Finals matchup is finally set, and the Miami Heat and Denver Nuggets are going to battle it out starting Thursday night to find out which team is the best in the association this season. Heading into game one, the Nuggets are favored by 9 points, and they're minus 390 favorites on the money line. Meanwhile, Denver is also minus 450 favorites to win the entire thing. And if you think the Heat will pull off the upset, a $100 bet could win you $330 if they make it happen for you. There's no better place to bet on the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thanks for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view today and every day. Everydayers, make sure you come back tomorrow. James and I will be back to wrap up the week here on the show. But for now, let's get back to Pro Football Focus's Trevor Sikkema. Trevor Sikkema on Twitter at Tampa Bay Trey, providing NFL and NFL draft coverage for Pro Football Focus and the co-host of the NFL Stock Exchange. Just Wednesday, Trevor named his top 3 Buccaneers players on their roster this season. So make sure you go check that out. It's over at PFF.com. Always doing great stuff there. Trevor, the Buccaneers kept more free agents this offseason than I think most expected them to, and even added some others from some other teams. But when you look at the ones that got away, or even the ones they gave away, if that fits the bill here, which free agent loss stands out the most to you?
You know, I kind of go back to the offensive line, and I guess it's to be seen. But, you know, moving on from Donovan Smith and moving on from Shaq Mason, a year removed from having to move on from Alex Kappa and Ali Marpet, it's just not a lot of familiarity that's on that offensive line when that offensive line was what you were boasting as a team. You know, Ryan Jensen and Tristan Wirfs are the only 2 left. And so that just leaves a lot of question marks along the offensive line. And maybe the change was for a good reason, right? Maybe Tristan Wirfs is destined to play left tackle, and Luke Gedeke is going to be a fantastic right tackle, and they've got the guys to play on the interior with Matt Filer and hopefully a fully healthy Ryan Jensen. And I mentioned Cody Mock being able to step in right away. Maybe this is long-term a really great thing for the team, but it's hard to look at it right now and say, man, you got 2 new quarterbacks competing for this quarterback job. Leonard Fournette's out the door. And look, I think that cutting Lenny was actually a good decision for them, giving more carries to Rashad White, who is clearly the more effective back when he was getting the ball. But, you know, he's a feature back now. He's the top of the depth chart for the first time. Whoever's playing quarterback is going to be starting quarterback for the Buccaneers for the first time. And you got an offensive line that will be playing together in week 1 for the first time. We'll be going against regular season speed for the first time. And so losing those 2 players and leaving as many question marks, I think that's probably the area that is the toughest pill to swallow. Because, you know, I think that losing Mike Edwards is kind of going to suck, but you bring in Ryan Neal, who I like a lot, who is an easy 1 in, 1 out. Sean Murphy-Bunting, okay, you move on from him. Yes, the depth at corner is pretty scarce after he is gone, but I feel like Sean Murphy-Bunting wouldn't have been worth the contract that they were going to offer him anyways. So you probably got to make the change there anyways. So you lose Akeem Hicks, who I think was a big loss, but they add Greg Gaines to make up for it. So for a lot of the areas in which they lost players, they did bring some new guys on the roster to help mitigate that. And change doesn't have to be bad, right? Change could have been for the better, no matter how you look at it. But when he asked that question of the guys who got away, it might really impact this team, it is those offensive line players who just leave a little bit more question marks to a really important area.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, that unit, like we talked about before, they play, it's five guys playing as one. And like you just said, they're going to be doing it for the first time really in week one of the NFL season. And it's, it's test time. So that's a hard time to start learning how to really do this thing. But let's flip the coin to the other side now. And let's just take Baker Mayfield off the table, because obviously a new starting quarterback is going to be the biggest addition. So which free agent do you think that they added that could have the best chance of really making an impact on this team this year?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of them already. Like I'm excited for what Matt Feiler could be as a potential starter on this offensive line. I like Chase Edmonds being a depth guy for them. Greg Gaines, I think, was a really underrated signing for them. But if I had to pick one, I would pick safety Ryan Neal, because Ryan Neal was an underrated playmaker and a versatile player for Seattle secondary. I think that he is going to be perfect for this team. He continues to allow them to have this 3-deep safety rotation where they've got a lot of different guys that they can move in and out. Todd Bowles' defense is very versatile in not just how he approaches his fronts along the defensive line, but also what he does on the back end. So you've got Antoine Winfield, you've got Ryan Neal now, and I think that having those two safeties there to be able to interchange between free safety and strong safety responsibilities is going to be really important with them. Now, I don't know how comfortable they are in the depth beyond that to go with as many 3 safety looks as they had before. But if Neal's not on this team, safety would have been a huge question mark, I think, outside of Antoine Winfield Jr. And so Neal, I think, is going to be a major impact player for them. And he's the guy that I would point to say, I'm the most excited to see what he is able to do with this group.
Yeah, and I Locked On Seahawks host Corbin Smith came through when that deal was done, and he's extremely excited for the player to see what he's capable to do in a Todd Bowles defense as well. Of course, another player that brings a lot of excitement, a little bit of drama lately, especially the last year or so, linebacker Devin White. After this week's OTA is complete, we've got the mandatory minicamp. The Buccaneers have said, and they sound confident, that he will be present for that mandatory minicamp. But we've also got training camp coming up. I know this team is kind of in the infancy. I do want to get to Devin White, but first, just on paper, I kind of want to see where you see the weaknesses on this year's team and the strengths on this year's team.
Yeah, offensive line. I mean, I kind of sound like a little bit of a broken record, but when you just have so many question marks with the guys up front, you mentioned it. To play good offensive line, it's got to be 5 guys moving as one. And there's just no guarantee that that's going to be the case, not just in week 1, but at all this year. We don't know. And so that question mark, I think, probably presents itself as one of the weaker parts of this team. I think secondary as well. There's obviously like Jamel Dean and Carlton Davis and Antoine Winfield Jr. are 3 really great players, but it takes 6 or 7 guys to really make a good secondary. And you throw Ryan Neal in there, okay, you feel good about it, but where's the depth after those players? You got D. Delaney. I'm just looking at the depth chart now. D. Delaney's kind of slotted in to be that nickel player. I believe Todd Bowles said that he didn't want Antoine Winfield Jr. to play as much nickel this year. He wants him to play more as a strong safety. So that all of a sudden leaves a little bit of question marks at nickel. And it's just really thin after that. It's a lot of young guys, but it's a really thin, inexperienced secondary behind him. So that, to me, is a weakness of the team if the rotation isn't as deep as it needs to be. And then, God forbid, certainly any of these guys get hurt. It's not like we have a lot of guys in the tank that could really step up to take their places. And so the drop off might be pretty big in that area. So I would say the secondary and then offensive line are the 2 areas where I say they are the weakest, strongest. Wide receiver, obviously, I mean, that has to be the area that everybody's going to point to. I think it's going to be a monster year for Chris Godwin, right? I mean, he was coming back last year from injury, but you guys have read the reports. He's saying that he's got his explosion back. But I really do, man. If we get a fully healthy season out of Chris Godwin here, I think that he is going to look like that top 15 caliber wide receiver that he was before his injury. So, Mike Evans is going to be as steady as they come. So those 2 are going to, I think, reaffirm themselves as one of the best duos in the NFL. And so for strengths, I would definitely look to the wide receiver spot.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's turn to that linebacker, Devin White, who certainly was a strength during the Super Bowl run and has been a strength at times as well. He's been a big story this offseason. No new deal, no draft weekend trade. And of course, and like we just said, the confidence that he will be present for the mandatory minicamp due to some social media traffic, which seems to be how a lot of this is being handled. What do you make of the Devin White situation? Because, around the Buccaneers and the local reporters and all that stuff, I don't want to say it's been made a big deal, but it's certainly, I think, something that kind of raises the alarm a little bit. And then the drafting of Servassier Dennis during the NFL draft kind of added to that, but that could also be a Levante David future potential replacement as well, right? So do you, from the national perspective, do you think it's being overblown, or do you think it's about accurate what the response has been?
I was talking to some people about this not too long ago. I don't think the locker room impact is as big as some would assume that it is, because these players get it, right? They all understand that it takes one play and your career could be over. Like, you are trying to get as much money as you possibly can out of this league and out of this game as you can while you are healthy. And so, it's funny. I did a feature piece on Christian Watson, the wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, last week. And I asked him specifically a little bit about the Aaron Rodgers stuff. I was like, what was it like going through that last year, knowing how much of a distraction it could have been, how much the media was talking about Aaron Rodgers? And Christian Watson was like, honestly, he's like, it wasn't really a thing in the locker room. Like we did a good job of just like keeping that stuff out, and it's all family. It's brotherhood when we're in there. We're just trying to win football games. And if that team can tune out the Aaron Rodgers BS, then you better believe that I think other teams out there can handle when a guy is holding out for reasons of Devin White playing an extremely physical position that we know doesn't have a long shelf life in this league, and he's trying to get as much money as possible. So I think the locker room portion of it is overblown. Now, would I pay him $100 million? No, I wouldn't. And I understand why Tampa is slow playing this, because you got to remember this too. They have Devin White for this upcoming year. Now, if Devin White holds out the entire year, that's kind of a different story. I don't think he's going to do that, but that then is an interesting wrinkle that kind of gets into this. But if the Bucs, like, for you to trade Devin White, the team trying to acquire him will not only have to give up draft capital, but then also pay him a massive contract to make it worth it. This isn't going to be similar to what Roquan Smith got in his return. It's just not. It's going to be less than that. Devin White isn't that type of player that Roquan Smith is. So if it's going to be less, you got to think, all right, well, if they let Devin White walk next year, they're going to get a third or fourth round comp pick anyways, which is probably the price that they would get back in return for a trade. So the Bucs don't have to. They're not against the wall at all whatsoever. This is really Devin trying to get a new contract as soon as he possibly can before he plays more football. But in reality, there's no pressure on the Bucs to make any move. And if he wants to be the highest paid linebacker in the NFL, he's not worth the highest paid linebacker contract in the NFL. No. He's just not. If this was a, bottom part of the top 10 contract, like a top 12 contract for off-ball linebackers, okay, now you're talking about something that you could work with. But if he wants $100 million contract and he doesn't want to move on it, I understand why he's doing it. All power to him, shoot for the moon, and maybe they'll give you a little bit less than that. But so I certainly understand why he is doing it. But if I'm Tampa, I'm not going to budge. There's no reason for me to.
In this last stretch of the conversation, Trevor is going to tell us his take on what the future of Tampa Bay Buccaneers football looks like. So don't go away. He's going to tell us that coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Joined today on Locked On Bucs by Trevor Sikkema on Twitter at Tampa Bay Trey, co-host of the NFL Stock Exchange, and of course providing you NFL and NFL draft coverage for Pro Football Focus. And like you mentioned, Trevor, you got a great story up on PFF.com about Plant High product Christian Watson. It's a great read. Definitely recommend it. I read it just because I was really high on Christian Watson coming out of the Senior Bowl, and I really wanted him to land on a team that I covered. Unfortunately, he had two shots of doing it, and it didn't work out. It's not his fault, though. But if you want something more Bucs focused, Trevor also has reasons the Bucs will or won't make the playoffs this year, and you can read why they will or will not make the playoffs according to Trevor, Tampa Bay Trey on Twitter, and of course the other at 31 NFL teams as well. So Trevor, I wanted to ask you this question, and I kind of prefaced it in our exchanges setting up this interview. And I think that you kind of have a unique, advantage over other national media members that we might be able to bring here on the program because of your time around Buccaneers football and around the organization itself. And, you're a little bit removed from it, but it hasn't been too long. You've seen the good, you've seen the bad, and unfortunately, we've seen a good amount of ugly of Bucs football over the years. Everyone's kind of bracing for another run of Yucks ball, right? It's going to be more Yucks years coming up, but there's also a little layer that I kind of feel of a little bit of confidence from the fan base. I don't think some are really willing to admit that there's that little kind of simmering of confidence. What do you see potentially coming up? If you could pull out a crystal ball, this next era of post Tom Brady era Buccaneers football looking like?
I don't think it's going to be the Yucks. And for some people might wish that it would be for this upcoming year because the quarterback class for the draft seems to be pretty strong. And, with them not having a quarterback, it's that might be something that might be very advantageous to them if they can lose as many games as possible. But we know that the NFL doesn't work like that. And Jason Licht isn't going to operate like that as a general manager. I really do think that as long as he is the GM, this team's not going to be terrible. I think the roster, because you ask what this roster is like to me from a national perspective, I think they're a lot closer to turning the page to whatever the next chapter is of Bucs football than they are keeping this winning window open with this roster. Like you look at some of the best players on this roster. Mike Evans, he's about to be 30 years old. Okay. I'm not saying he's going to retire soon, but Mike Evans is going to be 30. Ryan Jensen, one of the best players on this team, he's getting up there in age as well. That he could retire in the next year or two. Levante David, same thing with him. Shaq Barrett, now with him coming off of his injury, is he going to be that same kind of player? So a lot of those star-powered guys that are established on the team are getting to the point where you go, okay, we're probably going to turn the page from these guys that really helped us establish that winning window previously. Now, you have plenty of players that are still young and up and coming. Tristan Wirfs is one of them. Vita Vea is another. Antoine Winfield Jr., Jamel Dean and Carlton Davis are back, depending on what happens with Devin White. Those players could establish whatever that next chapter is. But again, from a national perspective, I feel as though the Bucs are closer to a rebuilding phase than they are a winning window. And that's just kind of where I see this team. I don't expect them to be terrible this upcoming year. But again, for them to really get where they probably want to go, it might take them being terrible in a year or two. And that might be the best thing for them, because for as much as GMs and head coaches and everything, they never want to lose football games. When you are mediocre, it is just the worst place that you can be, because you never get a chance to truly slingshot a winning window for yourself. But like I said at the beginning of when I was kind of answering this question, Jason Licht has, to me, really hit his stride as a drafting guru GM. And as long as he is the GM, I don't think this team's going to be bad enough to pick in the top 4, pick in the top 3. He's just too good at drafting, if you ask me. Maybe they have one year where injuries are bad and the coaching staff's not what it needs to be and all this stuff, and everything goes against him, because we know that can happen. But I just don't. The question of, is this going to be the Yucks? I don't see it. I think that the roster is too talented, even with some of these older players, with the guys that they have coming up next, because Jason's just done too good of a job of drafting, and he will probably continue to do so because his track record speaks for itself at this point.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. A lot of talent on this roster, a lot of talent still to come up. And, it can be a gift and a curse sometimes, being as good as Jason Licht has been with some of these, with these picks, like you mentioned, maybe not being high enough to draft that franchise quarterback, but you can still do a lot of damage with the picks that you do have. It's always a gift, never a curse, when we have Trevor Sikkema on the program here. So, Trevor, appreciate your time again. Everybody, if you're not among the almost 70,000 people already doing so, make sure you follow Trevor on Twitter at Tampa Bay Trey, and find his NFL draft coverage over at Pro Football Focus. And, of course, find him co-hosting the NFL Stock Exchange. Trevor, hopefully can do this sooner rather than later. And thanks for helping me break in the new graphics package here on Locked On Bucs.
Oh, man, it is an honor, David. I appreciate it anytime you have me on the show.
One more time, a big thank you to Trevor Sikkema, Tampa Bay Trey on Twitter. You know him, you love him, you miss him, but he was back, at least for today, here on the Locked On Bucs podcast. Coming up tomorrow, James and I will be back. No more Trevor. I'm sorry, but we promise we won't make it as long as it has been until we get Trevor on again. So make sure you come back for James and I as we wrap up the week with you. In the meantime, if you've got questions or comments, you can leave them in the YouTube comments, email them to lockedonbucspodcast@gmail.com, or hit us up on Twitter @LockedOnBucs. Thank you so much for making Locked On Bucs your first listen of the day every day, for making this show a part of your day, part of your routine. And if you have anything else Tampa Bay Buccaneers related you wanted to know or you want to discuss, make sure you also follow me on Twitter @DHarrison82. And again, the show @LockedOnBucs. Until we speak again, be safe, be kind, fire the cannons, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.